Hello. In this piece we're going to be talking about evaluating extended arguments. I'll be doing a lot of talking during this presentation. Unfortunately, it isn't the type of subject that lends itself to a lot of flash or fun short video clips. Nevertheless, it's an extremely important section, if a less directly entertaining one, and I hope you'll stick with it. The actual content will, at least I hope, be extremely valuable throughout both your academic careers and in life in general. There are several important keys to evaluating extended arguments. The first important thing to note, though, is that this is a skill that one builds up slowly over time. You've already been developing it. If you've ever been in an argument, read a paper critically, or engaged the world in a similar matter, you have begun developing these skills. In this presentation, we are going to be talking a bit more specifically about what some of these skills are, but the most important factor involved for becoming an excellent critical thinker and writer is practice. One cannot become a great musician without playing an instrument. One cannot become a great engineer without building things. One cannot become a great athlete without practice on the field. Likewise, one cannot become an excellent critical writer without writing, and one cannot be an excellent critical reader without reading and thinking about arguments. If one expects that this is something that one can just learn in the abstract and then be able to immediately apply expertly, then one's hopes are bound to be dashed, just as if one thought one could listen to Eric Clapton give a lecture on guitar chords and then go out later that night and rip it up on stage. All skills require practice to master. As far as whether or not it's worth it for you to master this one, nobody can answer that for you, but I would urge you to think about how often you are called upon to make decisions in your life. Every day you're called upon to make choices that can make your life and the lives of those you care about better or worse. Your primary tool for making good decisions is reasoning. Reasoning well pays off tens of thousands of little ways during your lifetime, quite possibly more. When evaluating an essay, first find the thesis. Constantly keep this thesis in mind while you are reading the piece. What is the author trying to prove to her audience? You might revise what you think this thesis is as you go through the piece. The author might start off apparently making a modest claim and end up making a more drastic one. Keep in mind both what the author is implying you should believe, as well as what she is directly saying you should believe. Remember weasel words from the last presentation. In a similar way, essays can set a tone that make implications without stating them directly. If you think that this is what the author is doing, then you want to take note of whether or not you think the author supports this implied claim. Second, find the reasons that support the thesis. Continuously take stock of the support that the author is providing for the thesis. Also try to keep in mind what, if anything, these other pieces of support may imply. Do any of your fallacy alarm bells go off? Are authorities cited appropriately for the issue at hand? Does the author try to force the reader into a false dilemma? As you are being presented with arguments, an active reader or listener will be generating objections and counter-arguments. Good authors will anticipate many of these counter-arguments. Again, active listeners ask themselves if these counter-arguments are sufficient. Can they be countered themselves? More importantly, critical readers look for counter-arguments even when the piece they are reading is supporting their own point of view. Just because a piece supports the view you hold does not mean that it does so for good reasons. A person might agree with your conclusions, but do so for very bad reasons. An extreme example might be somebody who agrees with you about who to vote for president, not because they agree with your meticulous research about politics and the economy, but because they believe in numerology and the numerical value of your candidate's name happens to be a good number according to this person's numerological arguments. In such a case, you agree with who the person says you should vote for, but you think that this person has very bad reasons, and you should be critical of these reasons. This person isn't a good representative of why a rational person should vote for your candidate. Academic papers have a high standard of writing in that they try very hard to be objective, use neutral tone, make verifying research easy, and only include relevant information. Unfortunately, this is very dry reading. Even newspapers have moved away from drier journalistic reporting to more sensational reporting. So one important job when reading or listening to extended arguments is to eliminate non sequiturs and irrelevant information. When writing yourself, whether you include these elements depends upon your audience, but you should always be aware that you are putting in irrelevant information when you are. You should never be fooling yourself. When writing academic papers for classes, you should typically be trying to eliminate irrelevant information. Some exceptions may be if you're asked to write a moving speech for a speech class or a persuasive speech, or if you are writing fiction. When evaluating an essay, first find the thesis. Constantly keep this thesis in mind. Identifying evidence. As the author argues for her position, she will provide evidence or support for her conclusion. That is to say that she will provide reasons for believing as she does. Just some types of evidence may be. Authority. Not all appeals to authority are fallacious. Personal experience. This could be the author's experience, anecdotal interviews, appeals to the reader's experience. The author could use generally accepted facts, or appeal to common sense, or the author might intrigue the reader to do a simple experiment, or point out readily available observational information. And of course there are plenty of other kinds of evidence as well. Identifying evidence. As the author argues for her, we've spent a good deal of time with appeals to authority in previous presentations, so we'll not rehash that all here. Suffice it to say that you need to make sure that authorities are of the right kind, that the issue is one that can be settled by authority, that authorities are in general agreement, and so on. The value of authority is also not digital. That is to say, authorities are not either of ultimate value or valueless. In some cases, authorities may be of some value, but might not settle the issue. One of the types of evidence to be most wary of are appeals to personal experience. Appeals to personal experience are prone to many errors. First, because memory is subject to error and false memories easily replace true ones. Further, what we perceive is often tainted by what we expect to perceive. We have seen this in more detail in the section regarding psychological impediments to good reasoning, and also in the Brain Games video. In the case of anecdotal evidence given by the author, or even that attributed to others, one has to be careful that it is true. In scientific studies, people's reports about what they have seen are carefully tallied. But when politicians give speeches, they often tell tales of people that they have met who apparently don't exist upon investigation. Even harder to verify are the anecdotes told about people who told somebody else a story. In other words, second-hand stories. When the appeal is to the reader's own personal experience, one still has to be aware of the weaknesses inherent in personal experience. Is the author trying to get you to make a wide-sweeping judgment based on limited experience? For example, are you supposed to make a judgment regarding the country based on something that likely happened to you in your area? The common experiences of an audience of a particular piece of writing are not necessarily the average experiences of the population as a whole. Remember that the author knows the audience she is speaking to, and that this audience may have a set of experiences to appeal to that do not apply to the whole group of people that the piece's thesis is attempting to draw conclusions about. Appeals to common sense are just as dangerous. The brain is an organ that developed to make judgments about matters and circumstances that have largely changed in modern environments. Our intuitions are not always correct. One way to see this is to see how easily we are taken in by optical illusions. These illusions are very useful for maneuvering in 3D space in most environments. But if you actually want to know the truth, suppose say you are designing optical sensors, and you want to know the true color of an object, you better not let common sense trump what the physical science of optics is telling you about the world. Consider. It's common sense that tells us that the Earth is flat. It looks flat. It took a lot of work to discover it is round. Common sense tells us that the Earth stays still and the sun and the stars and the moon circle around us. It looks like it. It doesn't feel like we are moving. And it takes a relatively advanced and abstract understanding of physics to understand why not. Common sense tells us that heavier objects would fall faster than lighter ones. They feel like they are being pulled down harder. Single demonstrations by Galileo showing that heavy and light objects fall at the same speed were not enough to convince people this intuition was so strong. Common sense tells us that the more people who see an accident, the more likely one is to get help. But the bystander effect lets us know that when fewer people are present, one of them is more likely to call for help than when lots of them are present. Further, in test after test, people do not think that the number of people around them has anything to do with their decision to call for help, showing just how bad our introspection into our own psychology is. Common sense tells you that the set of all odd numbers plus the set of all even numbers is larger than the set of all odd numbers alone. But it's not. Infinites are very counterintuitive. Common sense tells us that the chair you're sitting in and the keyboard you are typing on are solid objects. Modern physics tells us that they are almost entirely empty space. And this picture doesn't do the case justice. If this were proportional to an atom, and if you read the text there, that black dot would be at the center of a football field with the electrons orbiting it at a distance of that football field. Everything else is empty space. We can give example after example. When it comes to the ultimate nature of things, common sense steers us wrong time after time after time. It takes careful analysis, research, and experimentation to make headway in getting past what common sense tells us. The upshot of all this is that, depending on what the piece is arguing about, appeals to common sense may be of questionable value. This does not mean they can be dismissed outright, but whenever one realizes that one is relying on what is perceived as common sense, one should ask if that common sense can be further defended. Consider. It's common sense that tells us that the generally accepted facts can be very useful shortcuts. One doesn't need to specifically state that dogs are animals, or that animals need to eat, or that people need to sleep to function, or millions of other facts that we rely upon. If people had to state every relevant detail in everything they wrote, papers would be enormously long. Nevertheless, one wants to be careful here too. Many commonly held beliefs people take to be facts, are in fact in error. Nevertheless, they are often repeated. Some of these are deliberately repeated by people who know better for political or social reasons, and then repeated by others out of error. Others are just errors that continue. Here are some examples. I'm going to give you just a few of these, but the point of all this is that generally accepted facts can often be wrong. One hears all the time that we only use 10% of our brain. Not true, not close. You won't find a neurologist saying this, but you hear it repeated so often on television shows and movies that many people believe that it is a scientific fact. The idea that you can't prove a negative is nonsense. People should know better since they prove negatives all the time. They do so in math class. They do so when balancing their checkbooks. In fact, the very statement you can't prove a negative is itself a negative statement. So if it were ever proven to be true, it would have to be false. In other words, it contains an inherent contradiction. Many people believe that gum stays in your digestive tract for years. Swallowing gum isn't good for you, but it doesn't get stuck in your system. It has often been repeated deliberately by religious groups, both that Darwin recanted his beliefs on his deathbed and that Einstein was religious. Neither is true. I'm not promoting or arguing against the idea of God here, but this is an example of a belief deliberately repeated by some who knew better, then repeated even more by people who didn't know better. The result is that now you still hear it said that Einstein believed in God on the news or in debates, even though he explicitly said, this is a quote, "It was of course a lie what you read about my religious convictions, a lie which is being systematically repeated. I do not believe in a personal God, and I have never denied this, but have expressed it clearly. If something is in me which can be called religious, then it is the unbounded admiration for the structure of the world so far as our science can reveal it." And there was no evidence that Darwin changed his views. In fact, he became more of a physicalist or materialist as time went on. The person who originated this claim, saying that he did, was someone who visited him once, then didn't say anything until quite some time after he died. Had Darwin changed his mind, his family, not a stranger, would have been the first to know and to talk about it, since his beliefs were a source of embarrassment to them, and Darwin himself hated causing them trouble. So had he changed his mind, he would have told them first of all and would have been quite vocal about it. Again, the point here isn't anything about religion. It is just that these two examples come up so often, especially in philosophy courses, and they show that oftentimes beliefs can be perpetuated, taken to be common truths that anyone could appeal to because everybody knows they're true, but they turn out to be false. One hears all the time that we only use just a few more to drive the point home. Reading in bad light isn't bad for your eyes. Cats don't kill babies by taking their breath. Cracking one's knuckles doesn't cause arthritis. Eating chocolate doesn't make acne worse, except insofar as sugar can, but there's nothing special about chocolate. You do not lose most of your body heat through your head. You should not feed a cold and starve a fever. Carrots have lots of health benefits, but they're not going to give you great eyesight. Your eyes need beta-carotene, but this vitamin is plentiful in plenty of foods. Sugar isn't good for anybody, but it doesn't make children hyper. Caffeine does not stunt your growth. And vitamin C does not cure the common cold. And there's a link at the bottom to these and some other health myths. Just a few more to drive the point home. Reading in bad light isn't bad for your eyes. Cats don't kill babies by taking their breath. Add relevant information and reasons to the argument you have read. As we have said, not everything can be mentioned in an argument. Some background information is assumed. Think about what information is being assumed. Is any of it questionable? Would any of it contradict any of the arguer's reasoning? Sometimes the arguer might hold an inconsistent or contradictory opinion without even realizing it. Or sometimes the reasoning or implication of the arguments or sub-arguments would have other implications or consequences that, although not directly contradictory to the thesis, the author would be unwilling to swallow. This doesn't disprove the thesis, but it shows that the author is being inconsistent and would have to let at least one of the two positions go. Facts versus value judgments. This book does do a good job of pointing out that ethical principles and even issues such as matters of beauty and so forth are not necessarily subjective. This is what philosophers spend so much time arguing about. So I'm going to make a bit of a distinction here. Empirical facts. These are facts that can be confirmed through the senses, scientific sorts of facts, measurable. Then there are facts of reasons. These truths can be determined purely by a relationship of concepts. We've already talked a bit about this. Something might be a tautology, necessarily true, contradictory, necessarily false. You might want to know if one concept is contained within another. For example, knowing that the concept of a square is a polygon with 4 sides with equal length and 4 interior angles of 90 degrees each, and knowing that a rectangle is a concept of a 4-sided polygon with sides of any length, so long as each interior angle is 90 degrees, you can determine that a square is a special type of rectangle. You can determine this truth through analyzing the concepts alone. You don't have to go out and examine thousands of squares and confirm that they are also rectangles. Value claims. Now there is no claim here that these are metaphysically different kinds of facts philosophically. Different philosophers, depending on their ethical theories and metaphysical views, for example, might place ethical value claims as empirical facts or facts as reason. That goes beyond our scope for now. I have these separated out for another reason. First, there are all sorts of value claims. One might claim that one thing tastes better than another or is more attractive than another. When looking at value claims, the first thing to ask is whether or not the author is making a purely subjective assertion. If the author is making a purely subjective assertion, something like, I like strawberry ice cream better than chocolate, then there probably isn't much to evaluate. If the author is merely saying that it is her own personal preference, then unless you're going to make an argument that the author's preferences are in some way confused, or that the author is misrepresenting her preferences, there isn't much more to say. The fact that the author prefers something isn't an argument that it's better or that other people should. But usually, purely subjective claims are not the source of arguments that one needs to evaluate. Typically, if one is evaluating a value claim in an extended argument, it is because the author is trying to convince the reader or listener that the value claim is correct in some way. If this is the case, then the author is usually saying that there is at least some objective element to the value claim. The most common value claims of this sort are moral value claims. We are very concerned with doing the right thing. As a society, we spend tremendous amounts of time debating not only the direct effects of policy, but whether or not those policies are in fact morally good ones. The very fact that we're presenting arguments about them and think that we can give arguments for or against them means that we're accepting at that point that they are not purely subjective, even if they have some subjective elements. Facts versus value judgments. This book ethical value claims. Now, we can't go into the kind of detail here that we would for an ethics course, but when evaluating moral claims, one has to consider on what sort of moral basis the arguer is holding these claims. Remember that nobody is going to argue for their ethical worldview as a whole when writing a paper for a particular policy. There are space restraints, time restraints, and restraints on the amount of patience of the reader. If I wanted to argue against a bill that would allow a company to pollute more, for example, I probably wouldn't start off writing a 500-page thesis defending an ethical framework in which to place the issue of industrial pollution. By reading the argument, we can get an idea for the type of moral framework an author is making a moral claim under. Here are some basic types. Is it a consequential type morality? That is to say, is the arguer attempting to say that the issue in question is a moral or immoral one because of the consequences that will result? If so, then looking at the potential or likely consequences of an issue is the place to focus your aim, or focus if your aim is to undermine the author's arguments under her own ethical framework. So is the argument concerned with whether or not something will cause harm to others, people or animals, or even other things one might care about, such as collective intellectual progress or art or preservation of nature? The important thing to note is that consequentialist arguments are ultimately concerned with what the outcome will be. When analyzing these claims, one needs to ask if the author's analysis of the possible goods and harms is accurate, and also if they leave goods and harms out. Are they looking long-term enough? Do they consider everybody affected? Do they seem to care about everybody affected? And so forth. Principle-based arguments don't argue that there are necessary good or bad consequences if something is done or not done, but rather that doing or not doing something falls into line with a moral principle. So a consequentialist argument against gun control, sometimes given by gun advocates, is that they think that crime rates would go up if people didn't have guns to defend themselves with. A non-consequentialist principle-based argument they give is the restriction on guns would violate a basic right. In other words, maintaining that right has at least some value independent of any consequences associated with it. One might think that there are principles to promises not because of good results, but because promises should be kept, or that killing is always wrong, not because killing always causes more harm than good, but because of a principle of the sanctity of life. The important thing to note is that if somebody is making a principle-based appeal, counter-arguments that appeal to bad consequences are going to be of limited value to that person. If the person holds that the principle outweighs any consequences, then consequences are irrelevant, and one would then need to either argue that holding that principle is problematic, or that there are some problems with the principle itself. If one holds simply that the principles have value in addition to consequences, then positive or negative enough consequences might override that principle. For example, should one never break promises? What if breaking the promises were the only way to stop a nuclear bomb from going off in the middle of New York City? If the principle was absolute, then one would not break the promise based on the negative consequences of the bomb. If the principle just had moral weight, then enough weight in terms of negative consequences would outweigh it. The next thing I listed here are absolute rules, often religious rules such as the Ten Commandments or religious edicts and so forth. This would be a subclass of principles, but I listed it separately because many types of ethical principles are often more general and argued for systematically. Arguments that depend on appeal to a religious rule or interpretation, however, are often in danger of being circular, or at the very least, only being convincing to an audience that already agrees with the arguer. If, for example, one makes a lengthy argument that premarital sex is wrong by citing biblical passages that state simply that premarital sex is wrong, this argument will do nothing to convince people who do not believe in that religious rule, or who do not believe that particular interpretation. Now, the arguer could go on to defend why it is the best interpretation, in order to try to convince those who agree, for example, that the Bible is right in all things, but think that it has different interpretations. But again, one should notice the limit of those who it can convince. In order to convince others, one would need an argument that one should logically accept that the Bible is right in all things, or at least in this thing. And that would be a lengthy treatise on religion that would likely go beyond any argument the paper or the author is trying to give at the moment. The point is that arguments of the form X is wrong because Y says it's wrong tend to be unconvincing to people who don't already believe in the authority of Y. If, on the other hand, Y is something very general that many people believe, such as causing harm is bad, then one can argue that many sorts of different things might be wrong by appealing to the bad consequences that they might have. Likewise, if Y is a principle that's defended not on authority but on argument, that argument can be given, though this might be a longer sort of argument, or maybe even a long treatise, or often such principles are sufficiently general that people tend to accept them to one degree or another, such as we should keep our promises. Ethical value claims. Now, we can't go into the kind of detail here that we would for an ethics course, but when evaluating moral claims, one has to consider on what sort of moral basis the arguer is holding these claims. Remember that nobody is going to argue for their ethical worldview as a whole when writing a paper for a particular policy. There are space restraints, time restraints, and restraints on the amount of patience of the reader. So that was a lot. So I thought I would just recap some of what we've said about ethical value claims. The purpose of it was not to confuse you by introducing you to a lot of new terms. The purpose was to show you how you might approach evaluating the moral claims others make. So here are some main points to take away from that. Usually, people don't spend a lot of time arguing over ethical claims they believe are completely subjective. When people make ethical arguments, they do so within the context of a particular ethical theory. They may not know or even have a name for the ethical theory, but they at least have a context for evaluating ethical claims themselves. In order to evaluate the reasoning of the author within her own framework, one has to try to understand what kind of criteria she is using. The two types of major ethical theories or criteria are consequential, things are good or bad because of what will result from them; principle-based, things are good or bad at least to some degree independent of consequences; and then ethical commands are a subset of this, and they run the danger of appealing to an authority that might severely limit the audience the arguer can influence. So that was a lot. So I thought I would just recap. Irony. Many times authors will argue ironically. This is making an argument that one doesn't actually support in an attempt to try to show how silly the other side is. It is arguing for the opposite of what one actually believes. This is different from playing devil's advocate, because when one is playing devil's advocate, one is trying to defend an opposing position to the best of one's ability. One is not giving silly or bad arguments. It's also different from the straw man or tilting at windmills fallacy. It's different from this fallacy because in the case of irony, the author does not intend that the argument be seen as a real argument that the opponent is actually making. There's no genuine attempt to fool anybody. Instead, irony tends to be used to do two major things, although it can likely be used to do more. It can be used to draw attention to something, often something horrible that is being ignored. This was the case with the Jonathan Swift argument mentioned in the book, where it was proposed that hungry poor people use children for food. It can be used as a type of reductio ad absurdum, in an attempt to show that acting or reasoning as one opponent does results in something silly. Irony is usually done with humor, This makes it a particularly effective tool for maintaining the reader's attention, winning favor, and propagating the piece or idea from person to person. Here's an example of irony for you to click on from the Colbert Report. It's more towards the end. There's a little bit of setup. As always, you can pause at the bottom of the screen. I'll give you a count to 5 to do so. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Irony. As an active reader, you should take note of responses and counter-arguments. Note possible counter-arguments and responses while you are reading. These might attack the truth value of the premises the author is using, or they might attack the reasoning of the piece. Try not to only think of responses, objections, counter-arguments, but try to think of how the author might respond to those objections. With practice, you develop the ability to construct a kind of dialogue in your head where you propose arguments and anticipate what might be said in objection to them. It is often good to write down possible objections either in separate notes or in the margins of the text, especially when reading academic work. You can then come back to these possible objections and flesh them out later. As an active reader, you should take note of some tricks of reasoning. When looking at an author's argument, get into the habit of asking yourself some questions to test out the argument. Can the argument be applied to itself? This isn't always relevant, but when it is, it can really be important. Remember a while ago we talked about the idea that many people believe that you can't prove a negative. But this itself is a negative statement. The universal claim that is being made by the proposition that you can't prove a negative cannot be applied to itself. And that's a major problem. This is what's known as a self-defeating argument. Try to take the argument to the extreme. If the author's argument allows for it, see what happens when you test the argument with extreme cases. These might be hypothetical. Now you want to be careful you don't fall into a slippery slope fallacy. If the argument has a problem with extreme cases, the next question to ask is whether or not the arguer has a reasonable stopping place, or whether her principles force her all the way down to a real slippery slope. Do any of the sub-arguments or premises require that the overall conclusion be true in order to work? Sometimes this happens in a subtle and roundabout way. Checking for this is a way of checking for circular reasoning or begging the question. Try to determine what pieces of evidence or reasoning are most important to the argument. Mentally eliminate or change some of them to see how that affects the argument for you. This could give you an idea of where the real linchpins of the argument are. You can then focus more of your attention on investigating whether or not those justifications or pieces of evidence that the author provides are as reasonable as they are presented to be. Occam's razor, sometimes called the principle of parsimony, is also a very useful tool for reasoning, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Some tricks of reasoning. Occam's razor is often phrased in the following way. Entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity. A more common, though less precise way of stating it is that the simpler solution is more commonly the correct one. In other words, theory should posit as few types of things, entities, as possible. But one has to be careful. Multiple entities can be squeezed into one. Entity here doesn't mean being or living thing, it means concepts, or assumptions as well. How many new things do you have to posit about the world for the theory or hypotheses to work? For example, you are on the plains of Texas at midnight. It's pitch black. You hear hoofbeats coming towards you. What is it? There's a saying in medicine that it simplifies this principle. When you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. But why? Both horses and zebras are going to sound about the same running. Let's say you can't tell the difference by the sound. What reason do you have to believe it's a horse and not a zebra? Occam's razor helps justify your position. For the hoofbeats to be a horse, it could be a wild horse or one of the thousands around the area that escaped in any number of ways. To be a zebra, you would have to posit that a zoo or somebody who kept rare and exotic animals lives nearby, and that this animal, which is of a type that people are normally going to take especially good care of, somehow escaped. The zebra hypothesis, though it fits the facts of the hoofbeats equally well, is much less likely to be true. Of course, keep in mind that this is a principle. Sometimes the more complex explanation is true. Sometimes the hoofbeats really are from a zebra. Another note about multiplying entities. Suppose that you hear multiple hoofbeats. You could hypothesize a herd of horses, or you could hypothesize a giant centipede-type horse with 100 legs. Occam's razor does not suggest that you should imagine one centipede-type horse with 100 legs because it's just one entity. The issue is how many assumptions you are making. There are lots of hidden assumptions involved in the existence of the centi-horse, and far fewer in the idea of several horses running by. Below is a link to a very short video explaining the principle of Occam's razor in more detail. It's worth watching. Some common errors to watch out for. We've already talked a lot about fallacies, so I won't rehash all of those, but some of the following are extended mistakes that are repeated time and time again. The is-ought gap. This error occurs when somebody argues that because something is the case, it morally ought to be the case as well. People often slip from arguing about what we should do or what is the right thing to do to what we will do or what has been done. One special version of this is confusing what is legal with what is moral. Oftentimes, people will begin arguing about what is the right thing to do, and this slide into arguing about what is or is not against the law. But unless you also argue that laws are always moral, arguing about what is legal is of limited value. Usually the arguers know the legal status of what they're discussing, but are interested in the morality of the issue. So one might argue about the morality of copying music on the internet, for example. People who do this already know that it's against the law. If one was going to take the route of talking about the law, this could be relevant, but not to point out the obvious that it's against the law, but to make the further argument that we generally have a moral duty to obey the law. It would then be up to the person defending the other side of the argument to either argue that we have no such duty, or that we have no such duty in this particular case, or that the duty is outweighed by other moral considerations. Another special version of this, which is perhaps even more common, is to argue that something isn't natural and therefore isn't moral. In other words, that since something isn't the way things currently or naturally are, it ought not to be the way they are. Plenty of things are unnatural that are good in the sense of good for us. Houses, clothes, agriculture, vaccines, surgery, writing, language, and so forth. Also, lots of things are unnatural and presumably morally good, such as building houses for others or creating charities, and so forth. Plenty of natural things are bad, in the sense of bad for us: smallpox, infections, freezing in the cold, heat stroke and extreme heat, and so on. And presumably, plenty of these things are also morally bad. That is to say, if we saw somebody dying of an infection and we could save this person, it would be morally wrong not to do so simply because the infection was natural and the surgery to save this person from it was not natural. If you look for it, you will see this version of the is-ought fallacy appear all the time. Of course, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't be wary of putting synthetic things in our bodies. There are reasons why we have huge batteries of tests before such chemicals are approved for human consumption, and even then things go wrong. The fallacy isn't the idea that unnatural things have to be good for you, only the idea that somehow being natural is the same thing as being good. Some common errors to watch out for. A bit about necessary and sufficient conditions. When you find out that an author made a mistake, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because a thesis contains a bad argument, that doesn't mean that the entire thesis is undermined. Whether it is or not depends upon how necessary that argument was in terms of giving support for that thesis. When giving arguments, people often give lots of reasons for accepting the conclusion. Sometimes each of these reasons adds strength or weight to accepting the conclusion. If that is the case, then undermining one of these arguments only lessens the weight in favor of accepting that conclusion. It doesn't undermine the whole thing. For example, suppose that somebody argued that the death penalty was a good thing because it saves money and because it makes society safer because it deters other murderers. And again, this is just an example. I'm not arguing for it one way or another. Now suppose, as a counter-argument, you show that statistics prove that it actually costs more money to execute a person than it does to keep that person in prison for life. What you did was undermine one of the reasons given in support of the death penalty, but the two given reasons were independent of each other. In order to fully undermine the argument, you would either need to show that whatever reasoning I gave in an attempt to show that using the death penalty for other murders was faulty, or that this consideration is outweighed by other considerations, perhaps other harms, or because the death penalty violates some other sort of moral principles. The point here doesn't have anything to do with the death penalty. The point is that when a thesis has two or more independent means of support, showing that one is faulty doesn't undermine all the other support in favor of the position. Necessary conditions. On the other hand, sometimes conditions are necessary. If this is the case, then showing that an argument doesn't meet a necessary condition is enough to show that the whole thesis fails. For example, suppose that we are oath-bound to only pass constitutional laws. If that were the case, then showing that a law is inadvisable because it might have certain bad consequences only counts against passing that law. After all, it might have good consequences too. But if it was shown that it was unconstitutional, and if we took our oath seriously, that would be enough to show that we should not pass the law, regardless of any of their arguments in favor of it. Sufficient conditions. Other conditions are sufficient. If there is a sufficient condition, then that means that having that condition met is all that's needed to show the condition is true, or the conclusion is true. For example, suppose that somebody is on trial for murder. Showing that this person didn't have a motive, or that somebody else has a greater motive and access to evidence that fit the crime better, would all count towards finding that person not guilty. Those conditions just count in favor of the not guilty argument. However, finding out that the supposed victim is actually alive and vacationing in Hawaii is a sufficient condition to find the person innocent. It doesn't matter at that point how many blood stains there are, how much DNA evidence there is, or how strong the person's motive to kill the supposed victim is. If it turns out that the supposed victim isn't dead, then the argument for finding somebody guilty of that person's murder goes out the window. Sufficient condition. Now let's talk about some methods you can apply while reading. The margin note and summary method. The margin note and summary method has 4 steps as outlined in Cavender and Kahane's book. First, read the material to be summarized. Next, read it again. This time, mark the important passages with an indication of their content written in the margin. The first reading allows you to have a general idea of what to look for and an overall appreciation for where the piece is going and what might be important. It also gives you the ability to do the second step more accurately. Third, use the notes in the margin to construct a summary of the passage, indicating which of the noted statements are premises, which are conclusions, and so forth. This reveals the structure of the passage's argument. Finally, evaluate the essay by evaluating your own summary. Make sure to compare your summary with the actual text frequently to make sure that there are no significant or important discrepancies between the two. Now let's talk about the Curry method. Here is a method I often use. I did this countless times for difficult papers in philosophy classes. It is especially useful when dealing with papers and arguments where language might be a barrier. That's to say, with pieces that were written long enough ago for the linguistic style to be a barrier, or pieces written with especially complex sentences and unfamiliar words. Step 1. Number all the paragraphs. Step 2. Read the piece through quickly. Step 3. On a separate sheet of paper, or more likely a separate document file on a laptop computer or some such, read each paragraph and then write down next to the corresponding number what you think the paragraph says in your own words. There is an art to this. You don't have to include everything. Sometimes the original paragraph will contain lengthy examples that you can explain more quickly, so long as you do so in a way that is thorough yourself. But you need to, first, get all the important points in. Second, make sure you can understand it. And third, make sure that you will be able to understand it if you go back to your notes later. When you can use your own examples to illustrate the point, don't just copy the author's. Also, your notes for a paragraph may sometimes be longer than the paragraph itself. Sometimes the author may use concepts, ideas, and language that you're not familiar with. You may need to explain this. Sometimes your summary of a paragraph may be more than one paragraph long. Sometimes your summary for a very long paragraph may only be a sentence or two. You should expect to write a lot with this method. It's good writing practice. Also important, this is a good place to put in potential objections and counter-arguments you may have, which is another reason why this may get long. Put in your potential objections. To keep your asides separate from your summary, put them in brackets and in boldface. After going through the entire piece, write a brief summary that you put at the top of the piece, or top of your notes, outlining the basic thesis and arguments of the piece. Then write a paragraph or two expressing your reservations or objections or possible weaknesses of the piece. Once you're finished, you'll not only likely have a very thorough understanding of the piece, but you have a terrific set of notes and the beginnings of any kind of assignment that might involve these pieces. This method is a lot of work, and you don't necessarily need to use it for very small, easy readings. But if you are having any difficulty with the piece, I can tell you that this has been of tremendous help to me. What is more, it's a method that gives you practice writing, and that's very useful. This is something that's difficult to say too often. People clarify their own thoughts in the process of writing about them. Authors don't necessarily know everything they're going to say when they sit down to write about the piece. They sit down, and when they get up, their understanding is greater than it was before because they've organized their thoughts. Thinking on the page is extremely valuable. Writing is not just something you should do when you have an assignment to turn in. It's a method of thinking in an organized manner, as well as a way of recording your thoughts so that you can retrieve them easily later on. The Curry method. Here's a method. Okay, let's round things out by looking at a couple of examples from the book. These are not necessarily the best examples of evaluating extended arguments because they're only a paragraph or so, but they might give you an idea of the kinds of things to look for. If you're using the Kahane book, this is question 2 from exercise 8.1. What's wrong with a little censorship? Until quite recently, all sorts of things were censored in America. There were very strict rules about what you could show on television and in movies, and what you could describe in books, and what you could reproduce in magazines. Were we any worse off then? There were plenty of reasons to support government censorship when it comes to depictions of sex and violence. For one thing, it would encourage the entertainment industry to turn out material that is richer erotically. Another reason to support government censorship is that it would help temper the extraordinary brutality of popular culture. Society has an interest in protecting free speech and the free circulation of ideas. It also has an interest in protecting the moral sensibilities of its citizens, especially the young. Freedom without morality degenerates into servitude and libertinage, which is why judicious government censorship is not the enemy of freedom, but its guarantor. And the whole link to the piece, to Roger Kimball's piece, can be found at the bottom, so you can read the whole thing if you want. Okay, so let's look at this. What is the thesis? The thesis is that there's nothing wrong with censorship. The author uses the word little here, as in a little censorship. What kind of censorship is he talking about? From the context, it becomes clear at the very least that he is talking about censorship of sexual material and violent material. How little the amount of censorship is, isn't clear. What's his support? Appeal to tradition. This is how things have been, until quite recently, all sorts of things were censored. There's a vague rhetorical question. Were we worse off then? Well, worse off in what way and by what causes? And when is then? What years is he referring to? He thinks that censoring the entertainment industry will cause them to produce material that's richer erotically, but what does this mean? Is this personal preference of his, what he finds erotic? Is it something objective? This bears investigation. He also says it would help temper the brutality of popular culture. In just the information cited here, there isn't much evidence given, but remember, not everything in every piece is stated. Is popular culture violent? Certainly we can think of a lot of violent television and movies shows. Has it been getting worse? Well, we might need to identify the ways in which we mean better or worse. Or are you talking about the number of deaths, the graphic depiction of those deaths and the sense of gore, whether or not brutality is accepted as a way of resolving issues? Once spelled out, we need to look to the past to examine where things have changed and in what direction. In Westerns, for example, gunfights were a common method of resolving disputes, but they were not very bloody at all, and they did not seem very realistic. Was this important, and why? At the end, the author makes a stronger claim that somehow censorship not only is not the enemy of freedom, but helps guarantee that. Is this ever argued for in the piece? Admittedly, it's a bit hard for you to judge these things here, since we only have a segment of the piece. But again, if you want to read the whole thing, you can link to it below. Question 4. In response to outbreaks of violence on college campuses, gun advocates are lobbying colleges and universities to permit students to carry guns on campus. Although they insist that gun-toting students will discourage mass killers and thus make campus safer, they are wrong. Undergraduates are too young to handle firearms responsibly and are more likely to shoot each other in the heat of an argument than a mass murderer, a phenomenon as rare as a dodo bird. Even if a killer did show up and students tried to gun him or her down, the police would have a hard time sorting out the students from the gunmen. Besides, there are fewer than 20 homicides on campus a year, so colleges would hardly be justified in giving thousands of students the right to tote guns. Okay, let's give analysis of this one a shot. What is the thesis? That allowing or encouraging students to carry guns on campus in order to deter mass shootings would be a mistake. What evidence and arguments are given? Claim. Undergraduates are too young to handle firearms responsibly. Is there evidence to show that this is true? Research? Is this an appeal to common sense or common knowledge? If so, is it reliable? Claim. They are more likely to shoot each other in the heat of an argument than a mass murderer. This is both an appeal to common sense, the idea that if people get angry, they have guns handy, they might use them. This seems sensible, though we should be wary of common sense opinions and try to find actual scientific evidence if this is available. The other part is an argument that mass shootings are so rare that deterring one by having guns on campus is highly unlikely. Then one might be tempted to say that there's a bad analogy here by comparing shootings on campus to being as rare as a dodo bird. The dodo bird, after all, is extinct, and mass shootings, unfortunately, are anything but. But the author is using hyperbole to make a point. He isn't intending anybody to believe that mass shootings don't occur. His point is that they are rare. And they are. How rare? Well, it's time to look up some statistics at that point. He does give one, less than 20 homicides on campus a year. So that's pretty rare. So he is giving the argument that the likelihood of averting a crisis like a mass shooting are going to be far more rare than the likelihood of some sort of gun violence or gun accidents occurring if thousands of students start carrying guns around. Finally, he gives the argument that even if there was a mass shooting and gun-toting students tried to stop it, that when trained police arrived, they wouldn't be able to tell the good guys from the bad guys. This argument seems reasonable on the surface. In the heat of the moment, anybody without a uniform carrying a gun may seem like the enemy. Of course, this is just an initial impression. Analysis or evidence may prove this cursory reasoning wrong. So what do you think of this argument overall? Okay, well that about wraps up this presentation. The last thing that I would like to say is that when evaluating a piece, it's a perfectly legitimate stance to withhold judgment. It isn't always advisable to form an opinion right away. You might not feel you have enough information. It's perfectly reasonable to refrain from forming an opinion while one continues to investigate. And when one does form an opinion, one should always be ready to revise it if the grounds for holding that opinion change. Until next time. Okay, well that about wraps up this presentation. Consider tone and emotive language. We are persuaded by excellent writers and good writing. Emotive writing can also help to persuade us. Excellent writers who are intending to persuade rather than just investigate the truth use both these facts to their advantage. The more aware you are of tone and emotive use of language, the more you can guard against manipulation by irrelevant factors extraneous to the arguments. The book suggests circling words or underlining them. One thing you might do is highlight such words with different colored highlighters. This is probably not a practice you'll continue for years and years, while jotting down notes about counter-arguments, potential objections, weaknesses, and implications will always be useful. But it is helpful to do this for a while so you get the feel of the presence of emotive language. Also, it's useful to do this occasionally, even once you become masterful at this, when there are especially egregious examples of this kind of manipulation. Consider tone in